The sound of steam logging began through the timbered 70 years. The final silence fell on one of the most colorful chapters in American history. What kind of men left these stumps? What kind of world did they live in? What was it like here 70 years ago? Listen.
There used to be a logging camp right where we're standing. Old photographs show what it was like. It was a little ox team operation where my father was a partner, and I went to work there when I was 15 years old. That proposition, we were out there to make our fortune. There wasn't any gold to dig, or buffalo to hunt, or wild cattle to round up, so we had to try it on timber. We built skid roads out of logs laid crosswise back into the timber that we meant to cut. There was something laughable about us puny little critters tackling those tremendous trees with nothing more than tools that we could hold in our hands. And we felt that every big tree we dropped was a personal victory, and posed, or sometimes in our Sunday clothes, for photographs of our bigger conquests. We took rain, cold, back-breaking work, danger, and even death in stride. Steam power never was successfully applied to falling. The old methods never changed until after World War II. We put down an awful lot of timber with those hand-powered misery whips. We were fairly satisfied with hand falling, but we sure weren't satisfied with oxen for hauling out logs. They were only good for short downhill pulls, slow as a glacier on flat ground, and they drew flies. Most of us figured we'd never get ahead with our fortunes hitched to ox teams. And besides, a lot of us were machinery-minded and full of Yankee ingenuity. We believed in power. In those days, power meant steam.
Amazing invention! Miracle of ingenuity! Dole Beer's patented steam logging machine. Fame and fortune awaits those enterprising loggers who avail themselves of the unlimited power of steam. This road near Shelton, Washington, follows the grade of an old logging railway, leading back to where enterprising loggers first did avail themselves of the unlimited power of steam.
You can bet those first steam engines really impressed us. The engineer was a man of pride and dignity, with the latest marvels of scientific progress at his fingertips. Gone were the oxen. A horse pulled the line far out along the skid road, where the hook tender and his crew dogged it to a log, using blocks for extra leverage. A couple of turns of line were flipped over the spool, and the engineer shot the steam to her. The line tender scrambled to get the slack out of the way. The log came out of the woods, unless it hung up or the rig broke down. Of course, we still loaded cars by hand or with horses. But we finally had the power needed to log those giant forests. We called the machines donkey engines. We began to figure out improvements and built them into our donkey engines. We replaced the spool and line horse with a main line drum to pull the logs in and a haulback drum to get the line back to the woods. We soon figured out how to use steam donkeys instead of horses for loading cars. We took to using one donkey to yard logs from where they fell to a skid road, and maybe 2 or 3 more donkeys along the road to skid them to the railroad. Another to load cars. This method, ground lead logging, was in general use up till about the middle of World War I.
Modern loggers live at home and drive to work. In the early days of steam logging, a logger's life was different.
When I first came to Hoquiam, Washington, it sure didn't look like much. I was just 17 years old, fresh off at the ship from Norway, and could speak about 5 words of English. I tell you, I was plenty scared among all those strangers until I met a fellow immigrant who he helped me buy some logging boots and get a job for grub and a bunk and $50 a month. Next thing, I'm riding out to a logging camp with fellows speaking Russian and German and Finnish and French Canadian and English and Swedish and some talking Norwegian, so I felt a little better. Then we got to camp. There was a big crowd waiting for the train. The whole crew had just quit because of bad food, and they had their bedrolls, and they watched them pretty close for fear the bed bugs would just walk away with them. That was some camp. A careless man could drown in the mud. You could stick your hands through the cracks in the buildings. The bunkhouses had 1,000 cold drafts, and one big stove with about 100 pieces of wet clothes hung around it to dry, smelling strong enough to choke a skunk. The bunks were padded with straw and bed bugs. During the winter, we mostly got along without baths, and I tell you, when it warmed up in the spring, we just jumped in the river and washed the winter away. Those old camps might have been all right in the ox team days, but it didn't take steam loggers very long to figure out something better. We made buildings we could load on railroad cars and move them right along with the work. For their times, those were pretty good camps. Warm bunkhouses, maybe only 10 men to the room, shower rooms, clean cookhouses, and food. It wasn't fancy, but I tell you, we ate big and we ate the best. Building railroads was tough work in the early days. That was before they invented the bulldozer. We worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, rain or shine, and it only shined once in a while. We built a track right through the big timber, and pretty soon trains were hauling that timber out to the mills. You should see some of the railroads we built. When we came to the canyons, we built trestles, and it didn't matter how high or how long they were. We just got up there in the air and put them together, one piece at a time, till we came to the other side. When we came to the steep hills, we built inclines and rigged cables to pull the empty trains up and snub the loaded trains down. It worked like a charm, unless something broke. If you knew where to look, you could still find some steam in 1966. But I remember when the steam locomotive was the heart of the logging operations. Some didn't look any different from those used at the time on regular railroads. But there were a lot of peculiar-looking logging locomotives, specially built to go where railroads never went before or since. A good many used gear drives to boost up the pulling power, and they could all go around bends sharp enough to twist your neck. Engine builders had a lot of ideas about the best place for the cylinders, straight up and down at the side, or coming together under the boiler, or working at an angle on both sides. And loggers used big mainline Lokis as good as anything you'd find on the Northern Pacific. The great steam locomotives are all gone now, but those of us who built and worked on steam railroads will never forget them.
You could hear the trains in the 1900s, the 1920s, or the 1940s. They were always there. the heart of steam logging, no matter what other changes came. This beautiful residential suburb of Seattle looked considerably different when the boys came marching back from World War I. Let's hear about it from one of them.
You'd never recognize it. It was all thick timber until we started cutting in 1919. Nobody lived here or could live here until we cleared it off, but I don't think we gave that angle a thought. We were loggers, first, last, and all the time. The Panama Canal had opened volume markets, and we were out for volume production. Ground lead logging died a sudden death. Everybody put their rigging up in the air. We generally picked a standing tree for a spar. A high climber cut off the limbs and top and hung the blocks and guy lines. We called it high lead because the main line and haulback went through blocks 100 feet in the air instead of laying along the ground. Choker men hooked the rigging to the logs and scrambled out of the way. The high lead system lifted the front end of the logs as we pulled them in. There was plenty about logging that appealed to a young buck like me. I like to get my picture taken with the things I thought worthwhile. The big log, the long tree, the highball crew, proud of its record production. But I'll guarantee when we got our pictures taken was the only time you ever saw us so solemn, except maybe the first day back after a trip to town. A hotshot rigger had no trouble getting a job in the 20s. Everybody was crazy for higher production, bigger machines, lower costs, more power. High lead was just a start. We combined the yarder and loader into the so-called unit. And as for ways to use power, we invented one system after another, each bigger and faster than the last, until it seemed like the sky was full of rigging. By this time I was working in the mountains with a bunch of real highball loggers. The drive for high production reached its climax with the interlocking skidder. It could sit on one spot and log a circle 4/5 of a mile in diameter. A steel tower replaced the spar tree. The system used a skyline so logs could be lifted at will while the machine yarded them in. It straddled the railroad tracks. A string of empty cars moved right under the skidder. They came back out one by one for loading. The whole rig weighed about 300 tons and used a crew of about 25 men. This was big-time logging, and I looked down on people who were still fiddling around with little stuff like high lead. I got my laughs from crazy ideas other people kept trying out, such as yarding with tractors, or hauling with trucks, or trying diesel engines instead of steam. We were hard-nosed loggers. I looked out for myself, and if anyone got hurt, that was his tough luck. If he wasn't willing to run the risk, he ought to stay out of the woods. Steam engines were bound to cause fires once in a while. It was a chance we had to take. If we happened to set the woods afire, I fought fire. I wrote off the lost time, and I guess the owners wrote off the lost timber. Forest land owners insisted land like this would grow timber again. That was their lookout, not mine. I was paid to help get logs.
So that was what steam logging was like as it reached its climax toward the end of the Roaring '20s. Changes following the Depression and World War II made steam machinery increasingly out of date. Events like the retirement of the last steam locomotive aroused plenty of emotion. New machinery and new methods have taken over in the forest industry. Now that it's gone, we begin to realize that the age of steam logging was a period of wonderful accomplishment. When steam logging began, the Northwest was only a handful of people scratching at the edge of a monstrous, uninhabitable forest. The loggers came and worked. Where they seemed at the time to be destroying the land, the stumps and litter have disappeared under millions of acres of lustily growing new forests. The loggers cleared land and furnished building materials for the cities and the towns that make the Northwest home to millions of people. The great permanent forest industries they founded provide half the livelihoods of Washington and Oregon. We live now in the better world they helped to build, while the age of the steam loggers passes into history.